August 17, 1945. The sun rises over the jungles of New Guinea, casting long shadows across a field of silent machines. Rows upon rows of M3 half-tracks sit motionless in the tropical heat, their treads caked with red mud, their armor plating streaked with rust and rain. The war is over. The radios crackle with news of Japan's surrender. But here, in this forgotten corner of the Pacific, 10,000 vehicles stand abandoned, left behind like the ghosts of a conflict that consumed the world and then, just as suddenly, moved on. A young Australian dock worker named Thomas Weir walks among them, his boots squelching in the wet earth. He runs his hand along the hood of one half-track, feeling the metal still warm from the equatorial sun. They just left them, he would write in his diary that night. Thousands of them. Good machines. American machines. Just, left. It is a scene that will repeat itself across a dozen islands, 100 airstrips, 10,000 miles of conquered territory. Okinawa, Saipan, Guam, the Philippines, Tarawa. Everywhere the American war machine had rolled forward with unstoppable momentum, it left behind the instruments of its victory. But this was not carelessness. This was not waste. This was something the Imperial Japanese Army, and indeed, the watching world, could never have predicted. This was abundance on a scale that redefined the very nature of modern warfare. To understand what those abandoned half-tracks meant, we must first understand what they represented to the men who faced them in battle. In the winter of 1942, Japanese intelligence officers gathered fragmentary reports from the Solomon Islands. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal, but it was not just the landing that concerned Tokyo. It was what came ashore with them. Observers described vehicles that moved half on wheels, half on tracks, hybrid machines that could traverse terrain no conventional truck could navigate. They carried men and supplies through mud, over coral, across rivers. They mounted heavy machine guns and could provide mobile fire support. The Japanese had nothing like them. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the architects of Japan's Southeast Asian campaigns, studied the intelligence reports with growing unease. Japan's military logistics relied on human porters, pack animals, and light trucks confined to roads. The concept of mechanized infantry, soldiers who could be transported at speed across any terrain, protected by armor, supported by mobile firepower, was revolutionary. The Americans, Tsuji wrote, do not walk to war. They ride. But even this observation failed to capture the full scope of what was coming. The M3 half-track was not a secret weapon. It was not a prototype or a limited production marvel. By 1943, American factories were producing half-tracks at a rate of over 2,000 units per month. Autocar, Diamond T, International Harvester, White Motor Company. For manufacturers working in parallel, churning out variants for every conceivable purpose, personnel carriers, motor carriers, gun tractors, ambulances, command vehicles, anti-aircraft platforms. By the war's end, more than 41,000 half-tracks would roll off American assembly lines. This was the secret the Japanese never fully grasped. It was not that America possessed superior technology in every category. The German Panther tank was arguably better than any American tank of the war. It was that America could produce good enough technology in quantities that overwhelmed all opposition. A single M3 half-track might be destroyed in combat, but 10 more would take its place. And then 10 more. And 10 more after that. Japanese soldiers dug into bunkers on Tarawa and Peleliu watched the half-tracks come ashore in wave. They fired at them with everything they had, rifles, machine guns, light artillery. Some half-tracks burned. Some bogged down in the sand. But they kept coming. Always, they kept coming. Sergeant Kenji Ishikawa survived the Battle of Saipan and was captured in July 1944. In his debriefing, recorded by American intelligence officers, he described what it felt like to face the American advance. We were told we would stop them at the beach, he said through a translator. We were told Japanese spirit would overcome American steel. But they did not come with just steel. They came with everything. Vehicles we could not stop. Machines that brought more machines. We destroyed one, and 3 more appeared. It was as if they had an entire factory behind their lines, building new weapons while we fought. This was not metaphor. This was precise observation. The Americans did have factories behind their lines. Thousands of miles behind their lines, across an ocean, in a homeland untouched by bombing or invasion. Those factories operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They employed millions of workers. They consumed resources from across 2 continents. And they poured their output into the Pacific theater with industrial ruthlessness. But the half-track was more than a military asset. It was a symbol. a physical manifestation of a worldview fundamentally different from the one that drove the Axis powers. The Japanese soldier was taught to endure, to suffer, to overcome material deficiency through spiritual strength and self-sacrifice. The Bushido Code glorified death before surrender. Logistics were secondary to will. Victory would come through superior spirit, not superior supply chains. The American soldier, by contrast, was not asked to endure suffering if suffering could be avoided. If a hill needed to be taken, artillery would pound it first. If infantry needed to advance, they would ride in armored vehicles. If supplies were needed, fleets of trucks would bring them forward. The American military philosophy was not about spiritual purity. It was about overwhelming material advantage. It was about ensuring that American soldiers had every possible tool to accomplish their mission and come home alive. The half-track embodied this philosophy. It was designed for crew comfort, bench seats, overhead cover, shock-absorbing suspension. It was designed for reliability, simple engines, easy maintenance, interchangeable parts. It was designed for mass production, modular assembly, shared components with civilian trucks, standardized tooling. Every decision in its creation prioritized the soldier's life and the mission's success over aesthetic elegance or technological sophistication. And when Japanese soldiers captured American half-tracks, as they occasionally did in the early, chaotic months of 1942, they discovered something that shook them more than any battlefield defeat. Inside the vehicles, they found rations. Not the meager rice and pickled vegetables of the Japanese field diet, but canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee. They found medical supplies, morphine, bandages, antiseptic, far beyond what a Japanese unit of equivalent size would carry. They found maintenance manuals printed in full color, with detailed diagrams. They found spare parts neatly organized in toolboxes. One captured document, translated after the war, recorded the reaction of a Japanese supply officer who inspected an abandoned American half-track on Bougainville. "The enemy discards what we would consider treasure," he wrote. "A single vehicle contains more resources than our entire company receives in a month. How can we fight an enemy who treats such wealth as disposable?" This is the question that haunted the Japanese military for the remainder of the war. How do you fight an enemy for whom abundance is the baseline assumption? An enemy who can lose 100 vehicles in a single battle and replace them within weeks? An enemy whose abandoned equipment represents a strategic windfall? The answer, ultimately, was that you could not. Not through conventional means. Not through superior tactics or training or courage. The mathematics were inexorable. By 1945, the United States was producing more war material in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. The disparity was so vast that it ceased to be a matter of military strategy and became a law of industrial physics. But the story of the abandoned half-tracks is not simply a story of American victory through overwhelming production. It is also a story of what happened when the war ended and that production suddenly stopped. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio sets across Japan, announcing the unconditional surrender. Within hours, orders went out from Washington to every American military command in the Pacific: cease all offensive operations. Within days, those orders were followed by something even more startling: begin demobilization. The American public, exhausted by 4 years of war, wanted its soldiers home. Congress, sensitive to that pressure, mandated the fastest peacetime drawdown in military history. The vast citizen army that had conquered the Pacific needed to be returned to civilian life. Ships were needed to transport men, not machines. Priority was given to personnel. And so, across the Pacific, American commanders faced an unprecedented logistical question. What do you do with millions of tons of military equipment when shipping space is at a premium and domestic demand has evaporated? The half-tracks posed a particular challenge. They were too large to be easily scrapped on site. They contained materials, rubber, copper, steel, that had value, but extracting those materials in remote jungle locations was impractical. Shipping them back to the United States would consume cargo space needed for soldiers. Selling them to local governments raised concerns about flooding civilian markets with military vehicles or enabling potential future conflicts. The solution, arrived at through a combination of bureaucratic inertia and pragmatic calculation, was abandonment. Not casual abandonment, there were procedures, paperwork, inventories, but abandonment nonetheless. Vehicles were gathered at designated sites. Fluids were drained. In some cases, critical components were removed. Then they were left. On Okinawa, more than 3,000 half-tracks were driven to a coastal field and parked in neat rows. On New Guinea, entire motor pools were simply walked away from. On Saipan, vehicles were pushed to the edges of airstrips and left to rust. The same scene repeated on islands whose names most Americans would never know: Tinian, Espiritu Santo, Biak, Morotai, Leyte. The sheer scale of the abandonment is difficult to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest that more than 10,000 half-tracks, roughly a quarter of total wartime production, were left behind in the Pacific theater. Add to that tens of thousands of trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, and the figure becomes astronomical. One study estimated that the total value of abandoned American military equipment in the Pacific exceeded $4 billion in 1945 dollars, equivalent to roughly $60 billion today. For the local populations of these islands, the abandoned vehicles were a revelation. Many had lived under Japanese occupation, where scarcity was enforced policy. The Japanese military requisitioned food, labor, and materials without compensation. Shortages were constant. Then the Americans arrived, and suddenly the islands were flooded with goods. And when the Americans left, they left behind more wealth in material goods than most islanders had seen in their lifetimes. In the Philippines, enterprising locals began salvaging half-tracks within months of the surrender. The vehicles were stripped for parts. Engines were repurposed to power fishing boats and sawmills. Armor plating was cut up and used for construction. Axles and transmissions became parts of improvised farm equipment. An entire informal economy sprang up around the salvage trade. The Australian government, faced with thousands of abandoned American vehicles on its territory and in its mandated territories, initially tried to regulate the salvage. Permits were required. Auctions were held, but the volume was too great. Eventually, authorities simply allowed locals to take what they wanted, provided they didn't interfere with military installations. In remote areas, half-tracks sat untouched for years. Jungles grew around them. Rust consumed them. They became landmarks, the old tank graveyard, children would call them, not knowing the difference between a tank and a half-track, knowing only that these were relics of the war that had swept over their islands like a typhoon and then receded, leaving strange treasures in its wake. A photographer named Michael Collins documented some of these sites in the 1950s. His images show half-tracks swallowed by vegetation, their treads buried in silt, their armor punctured by decades of tropical decay. In one photograph, children play on a half-track in New Guinea, climbing over its frame like it was playground equipment, laughing, unaware of the battles it had seen, the men it had carried, the history it represented. But for those who had fought in the war, the abandoned half-tracks carried a different meaning. Japanese POWs who remained on the islands as laborers during the early occupation period, tasked with building roads or clearing airfields under Allied supervision, saw the vehicle graveyards and understood what they represented. One such prisoner, a former sergeant named Hiroshi Nakamura, wrote in a letter that was later donated to the Japanese War Museum, "We were told America was weak, that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort more than duty. But a nation that can abandon such wealth, that can leave behind what would supply our entire army, such a nation was never weak. We mistook abundance for softness. We mistook generosity for vulnerability. We were taught to glorify scarcity, to find virtue in suffering. But perhaps there is a different kind of strength in a nation that creates so much it can afford to leave things behind." This realization, delayed, painful, arriving only in defeat, cut to the heart of why Japan lost the war. It was not a failure of courage. Japanese soldiers had fought with desperate ferocity on every island, in every jungle, in battles that became synonymous with savage determination. It was not a failure of tactics. Japanese commanders had proven innovative and adaptable, especially in the war's early years. It was a failure of systems. A failure to understand that modern industrial war was won not on the spiritual plane but on the material one. That the side with more steel, more fuel, more food, more transport, and more ability to replace losses would grind down any opponent, no matter how brave. The Americans understood this intuitively. Their military culture was built around it. When a half-track broke down, you didn't repair it in the field with improvised parts and willpower. You called for a replacement. When supplies ran low, you didn't ration them to the edge of starvation. You brought in more supplies. When casualties mounted, you didn't glorify death. You brought in better medical care, faster evacuation, more effective treatment. This was not moral superiority. It was industrial capacity married to a specific set of cultural values: pragmatism, efficiency, the belief that problems had material solutions. The half-track, in all its utilitarian ugliness, embodied those values. It was not beautiful like a German Panther or elegant like a British Scout car. It was functional, reliable, mass-producible, good enough, in sufficient quantities, to do the job. And when the job was done, it was expendable. In the decades after the war, military historians and economists debated what the abandoned equipment represented. Some called it waste, a failure of planning, an embarrassment of riches squandered through bureaucratic ineptitude. Others called it inevitable, the unavoidable consequence of demobilizing the largest military force in history at unprecedented speed. Still others saw it as strategic messaging, a demonstration to the Soviet Union and other potential adversaries that America's industrial capacity was so vast it could treat billions in military hardware as disposable. There is truth in all these interpretations. But there is another truth, one that the abandoned half-tracks make visible in their silent, rusting testimony. They represent the distance between two worldviews. On one side, the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, nations that built their military philosophies around scarcity, discipline, and the glorification of sacrifice. These were nations that believed war could overcome material deficiency, that spirit was superior to steel, that a warrior elite could triumph over an industrial democracy. On the other side, the Allied powers, especially the United States, a nation that approached war as a problem of production and logistics. A nation that did not ask its soldiers to fight on empty stomachs or with broken equipment. A nation that believed the purpose of industry was to create abundance, and the purpose of that abundance was to preserve life, the lives of its soldiers, and ultimately, through victory, the lives of those living under oppression. The half-track was never the most glamorous vehicle of World War II. It did not inspire the awe of a B-29 bomber or the fear of a battleship. But it was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of the American war effort. Practical, reliable, mass-produced, designed to get soldiers where they needed to go, to protect them while they were there, and to be replaced. If it failed, it was a machine built not for glory but for function. And in the Pacific, where distances were vast, terrain was hostile, and supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, function was what mattered. The last recorded use of an American M3 half-track in the Pacific theater occurred not during the war, but years after. In 1953, a team of Australian engineers discovered a half-track on the island of Biak that had been maintained, painstakingly, lovingly, by a group of local villagers. They had kept the engine running using improvised parts. They had beaten out dents, patched holes, even repainted it using pigments derived from local plants. They used it to transport goods to market, to pull logs from the forest, to drive their children to the missionary school 20 miles away. When the engineers asked why they had preserved this one vehicle out of the dozens that had been abandoned on the island, the village elder, a man who had lived through both Japanese occupation and American liberation, gave an answer that was recorded in the engineers' field report. This machine, he said, brought freedom to our island. Not just freedom from the Japanese, though it did that, but freedom from distance, freedom from isolation. Before the war, if someone was sick, they died, because we could not reach the hospital in time. If we needed tools, we could not transport them. If we wanted to trade, we were limited to what we could carry. This machine changed that. It gave us movement. And movement is a kind of freedom. A few remain in museums, carefully restored, their treads cleaned, their engines rebuilt, their history preserved. But the vast graveyards that once dotted the Pacific have been reclaimed by nature or cleared for development. What remains is the lesson they taught, one that the Japanese learned too late, and one that subsequent generations have sometimes forgotten. Modern war is not won by spirit alone. It is won by systems, by factories that can outproduce the enemy, by logistics that can deliver overwhelming material advantage to the front lines, by a society wealthy enough and organized enough to equip its soldiers with not just weapons, but comfort, not just ammunition, but abundance. The half-track was never just a vehicle. It was a statement. It said, we will not ask our soldiers to walk when they can ride. We will not ask them to go hungry when we can feed them. We will not ask them to die for lack of equipment when we can build more equipment than any enemy can destroy. And when the war is over, when victory is won and the soldiers go home, we will leave behind the instruments of that victory, not because we are wasteful, but because we can afford to. Because we built so much that what we leave behind is less valuable than the space needed to bring our people home. This is what the Japanese soldiers saw in those final days, standing among the abandoned vehicles, understanding too late the nature of the enemy they had faced. Not an army of supermen, not a nation of warriors, but a nation of builders. A democracy that had transformed its factories, its farms, its entire industrial capacity into an engine of overwhelming material abundance. And in that abundance, deployed with ruthless efficiency across 10,000 miles of ocean, lay a power that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome. The half-track sit silent in old photographs now, rows of them, covered in jungle growth or sand, their purpose fulfilled, their war over. They are monuments not to waste, but to capacity, not to carelessness, but to a kind of strength that Imperial Japan, with all its warrior traditions and spiritual discipline, could never match. The strength of a nation that could afford to leave thousands of vehicles behind and still know, without doubt, that if another war came, it could build thousands more. That was the real secret. Not the half-track itself, but what it represented. A democracy armed with industry, a nation capable of producing victory through sheer material weight, and a worldview that believed abundance, not scarcity, was the foundation of strength. The rusting half-tracks taught that lesson to anyone willing to learn it. Some learned it standing in formation on the deck of the USS Missouri, signing instruments of surrender. Others learned it years later, salvaging what America had left behind, and marveling at what kind of nation could walk away from such wealth. August 17, 1945. The sun sets over New Guinea. Thomas Weir finishes his inspection and walks back toward the base. Behind him, the half-tracks stand in their silent rows, already beginning their slow return to the earth. The war is over. The machines that won it are no longer needed. And that, more than any battle, any strategy, any sacrifice, that is the true measure of America's victory in the Pacific.